Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. You know, I've had a lot of fun on this channel taking a look back at weird Golden Age superheroes, a time when it was the Wild West. Creators were throwing anything at the wall to see what would stick, and you'd get some superheroes with less than cool superpowers, like guys that were raised by condors and that made them learn how to fly, or people that thought throwing sticks of dynamite counted as a superpower. But even by the time we get to the Silver Age of comics, things were a little more grounded. DC and Marvel started to build up some new superheroes. It could still be pretty weird. We're going to look at some of the early growing pains of one of those characters, Ant-Man, and more specifically, his less than impressive archenemy, Egghead. Ant-Man is a superhero who has the ability to shrink, but it's worth noting that he's not the first. He's not even the second. The first shrinking superhero was created by Will Eisner and had the less than intimidating name Doll Man. He debuted back in December of 1939 in issue 27 of Feature Comics. He was created by Will Eisner and sold as a regular feature to Quality Comics. Doll Man's alter ego was Daryl Dane, a scientist dating Martha Roberts. One day, he was chatting with her father, a professor, who suggested a way Daryl could turn his formula into a liquid. Daryl is instantly successful and announces he has created a formula that can shrink a man to the size of a doll. Professor Roberts asks a reasonable question. What would that do to a person's mind? Daryl decides that the best way to find out is to just drink it and see what happens. That's just how science works. The professor tries to stop him, but Daryl guzzles down his formula, shrinks, goes crazy, and throws needles at the professor, but then instantly recovers. The professor asks him what he plans to do with this new discovery, and Daryl announces he'll use it for good. To that end, Daryl decides to spy on his girlfriend, and lucky for him, she was being blackmailed, and now he's there, so Daryl is able to beat up the blackmailer. He finds that even though he's small, he has the strength of one average man. By the following issue, he's created a costume and injects the chemical into his veins like heroin, and then goes out looking for criminals. The next prominent shrinking superhero was the Atom, created for DC Comics by writer Gardner Fox and artists Gil Kane and Murphy Anderson. Debuting in 1961's Showcase issue 34, scientist Ray Palmer is working on shrinking technology to enable farmers to grow more crops. A noble goal. Unfortunately, the technology is unstable, and his experiments always end with his chairs exploding. He likes to shrink chairs as test subjects instead of something organic like, say, fruit, because Ray is probably not a very good scientist. He happens to see a meteor fall in the woods and guesses that it's a super dense dwarf star. He opts to use this for his experiments, but that only results in an exploding typewriter. There's no good way to sell a ray that explodes typewriters because the average person can always destroy a typewriter without much help. Unfortunately, Ray Palmer, his girlfriend, and their friends go on a hike in an unstable cave and become trapped. Ray decides the best course of action is to try his new technology on himself, so he shrinks and climbs out, as compared to, say, shrinking some of the rocks. Ray pulls away some of the rocks so that his friends can escape, and gets ready for the shrinking ray to work off and for him to explode. It's worth noting he opted not to shrink an engagement ring, so I guess his plan was to let his girlfriend find it among his bloody remains. But when Ray grows back to normal size, he's pleasantly surprised to find that he didn't explode. He guesses that it's because some water from the caves got on his technology and decides to stop any further experimentation, forget about feeding the hungry, and to become a superhero. And, unlike Doll Man, Atom can shrink even smaller. So as far as origins go, we have two scientists who are trying to use shrinking technology. They decide to use it on themselves and then become a superhero. Now, how do you think Ant-Man's origin goes? If you said that he got his superpowers by grinding up ants and drinking them as a protein milkshake, you'd be wrong. Scientist Hank Pym is working on a formula that can shrink objects. He tests it on a chair. I know the Atom was doing the same thing, so it probably seems like it's too much to be a coincidence, but it probably is, because the Atom came out in October of 1961, and Hank Pym's story came out in Tales to Astonish 27 from January of 1962. Because of the production time to make comics, it's very unlikely that the creators of Hank Pym knew about DC's Atom story. After Hank proves that the serum works on the chair, he immediately proves himself a complete idiot by testing it on himself. He shrinks and is instantly in trouble, spending most of the issue running away from ants, and defeating them with his two advantages, a human brain and his knowledge of judo. He makes his way back to his serum and uses it to regain normal size, opting to destroy his formula because it's just too dangerous. And we never heard from him again. No, wait, that's not right. That's not what happened. No, instead, once Stan Lee, the editor, saw the sales figures for this issue, Hank Pym was brought back in issue 35, this time as a superhero called Ant-Man. He had a costume now. He had the ability to talk to ants as well as shrink, so there was at least something a little bit different. That said, being able to get small and talk to dumb bugs is really not something that puts you on the same level as, say, Superman, so your arch enemy probably also has to be a little less than impressive. The story we're going to read today comes from issue 38, with a dynamic enough cover by Jack Kirby using some foreshortening. Ant-Man is front and center with a powerful figure reaching for him, but a superhero trapped by flypaper and a bald guy in a suit takes away from some of the power of the layout. The details are what's going to sink this story. The story itself is called Betrayed by the Ants. That's something we can all relate to, right? Betrayed by ants. I get that ants are Ant-Man's allies, but it's hard to get emotional about being betrayed by them. What are they going to do? Not send you a Christmas card? Talk about you behind your back to these spiders? They're ants. The story comes from Stan Lee as plotter, his brother Larry Lieber as scripter, and art by Kirby and inker Dick Ayers. And now I'm just going to read this short story to you and make some snarky jokes at its expense. But just to be clear, it's not because I don't respect the creators here, it's that I know that they can do better. I know that they can. And so I think we can sometimes learn by missteps, so let's have some fun with it. Our story begins with the criminal underworld in terror because Ant-Man keeps stopping them. They're complaining that if they don't get rid of Ant-Man soon, they'll starve to death. And they haven't dared pull a robbery in weeks. You know how when people get desperate for money, they just stay away from robbing things. That's just what a desperate person does. So this does make sense as a starting point. They mull over how they're going to stop him and realize that brute force ain't the answer. Every time we tried, he's beaten us. And then this sad sack goes, brains! That's the answer! It'll take brains to lick the Ant-Man! Brilliant! These guys figured it out. I don't know why they even need help. They've obviously got the intelligence to take down Ant-Man. Cut to Washington, D.C., where there's a meeting going on with some government officials. The soldiers guarding the door outside say that the scientist inside is the guy they call Egghead. The government calls him Egghead? That's a lawsuit, buddy. The government officials accuse Egghead vaguely of committing crimes, saying, "It has been rumored that you attempted to sell secret atomic information to the highest foreign bidder. What do you have to say for yourself?" Egghead neither confirms nor denies this crime, instead just telling them that he sneers at them all. It's probably not a good way to stay employed. He tells them, "Anyway, you're just talking. You've got no proof and you know it." And they say, "Yeah, you're right. You know what? You're just fired. You'll never work for the government again." Cut to what we're told is the very next day, and Egghead is already meeting with these criminals. They're telling him that he needs to figure out a way to beat Ant-Man, and that if he'll do it, they will give him $10,000 now and the rest when you've defeated the Ant-Man. Agreed! Like I said, this comic came out in 1962, so $10,000 then would be sort of the equivalent of around $90,000 today, which is not nothing, but it's also not that much money to go up against a superhero, in my opinion. I think I would ask for significantly more. I don't know if that makes me greedy, or if it might be a clue that Egghead is not quite the genius everybody seems to be saying that he is. Case in point, Egghead's first step to defeating Ant-Man is he decides to watch documentary films on ants, which I'm sure can be fun, but I'm not sure what he's going to gain from this. My favorite detail here is Egghead enjoying his pipe. Apparently he's smart enough to outsmart mesothelioma. Next, he decides to read a book called All About Ants. You might think that he'd read a book called Myrmecology, the study of ants, but no, he just found a book called All About Ants and said, done. Egghead speculates aloud that since Ant-Man works with ants, he must have some method of communicating with them. He then says, ants are unable to utter sounds. Not true. They make chirping sounds, rubbing their legs together. It's called stridulation. And they don't use sign language. They actually do use body language as well as touching each other to communicate. The only way that they can communicate is by electronic signals through their antennae. Not even close to accurate. Ants communicate with pheromones primarily. That's dropping scents to warn each other about danger, to tell each other about food. They actually have some pretty complex communication methods. And I get that they might not want to dive in too deeply into the science here in a quick action-based comic book, but this was clearly Stan Lee and Larry Lieber just going, the hell with looking it up. Let's just make something up. It's not like in 60 years people will have access to a computer and easily be able to pull up this information and call us on our bullshit. Regardless, Egghead is able to invent the same technology as Ant-Man and be able to communicate with ants. Egghead's talking about tuning into ants' wavelength as though it's as simple as going out to your car radio to tune in the ant channel. For reasons I don't understand, Egghead goes to the outskirts of town, finds a random anthill, and decides that the best way to get at Ant-Man is to talk to these ants and have them spread rumors through the ant rumor mill all the way back to the ants in New York City. Before I comment on anything, I'm just going to read Egghead's words to the ants, and you just let it sink in that Egghead's plan is to say this stuff to ants. I am your friend. I have come to free you from the Ant-Man's rule. Help me to capture him, and then you shall be the master, and he the slave. Listen carefully to my instructions. Tell the Ant-Man that thieves are planning to steal the Wentworth necklace from the museum Thursday night. I think Egghead thinks that ants are way smarter than they actually are. Don't get me wrong. They do have impressive ways to communicate with each other. As a colony, there's a lot we can learn from ants. Pretty sure that they don't have vocabulary words for the Wentworth necklace or the museum, let alone getting that information to Ant-Man. And let me just pause and say, if they did get that specific information to Ant-Man, I would hope Ant-Man would be smart enough to go, wait, where did you guys hear about the Wentworth necklace being stolen from the museum? Where in the world did you get that specific information? When Ant-Man falls for the bait, lead him to the museum, have him enter through an open window where I shall be waiting for him, waiting with fly paper. Remember, free the Ant-Man and I will free you from his domination. All things considered, Egghead is offering the ants the ability to rule Ant-Man, one guy. And I don't know. I don't think ants are that interested in telling one guy what to do. They might be a little more interested if he was like, do this for me and I'll give you a sugar cube. Egghead drives off and we get a glimpse into his thought process here, saying that the first phase of my plan is over. The ants will not be able to resist the temptations I have offered, for I have appealed to their greed and their vanity. Every single panel is blowing my mind. Then Egghead explains his plan to the criminals, saying, and when he enters the museum, I'll be waiting with fly paper. Egghead, you're a genius. The denouement, the prestige of Egghead's trick, if you will, is that Ant-Man will have to forget, once he's trapped in a little piece of flypaper, that he has the ability to grow back to normal human size. Let's see how that goes. Cut to the museum that night. The burglars are actually stealing the Wentworth necklace, knowing that Egghead is about to frame Ant-Man. Ant-Man predictably arrives with an army of ants, but what he's not expecting is Egghead there with an air bellows. I do like that Ant-Man's small size is completely overlooked here. Ant-Man should be able to sneak into any one of hundreds of entrances to this museum, but Egghead just happens to know which one he's coming through. And a puff of wind knocks Ant-Man to the ground. And I gotta say, Jack Kirby's artwork is great. It sells this story. But if you break it down, we're still looking at an older, bald man just sort of sending a tiny puff of air, and that's enough to knock your superhero down. Not too impressive. The artwork sells it. Egghead speaks about his plans as Ant-Man is falling, something you can only do in comics. While Ant-Man is falling, Egghead says, "Ha! A perfect hit! He's falling right into the box which I lined with fly paper." However, Ant-Man stands right up. He's not stuck to the flypaper. Egghead is stunned. He actually explains to Ant-Man himself what's happening, going, You're rising to your feet. The paper isn't sticking to you. Why?" And then Ant-Man shows us a one-time superpower that he has in this issue and never uses again, to my knowledge. Yes, he has tiny little springs with cork in his boots. This is something like Ant-Man's fourth story, and I guess the writers have already forgotten that he has normal human strength in this tiny body. He should be able to just jump up under his own power. But for this story, and this story only, he turns into Inspector Gadget and has some springy boots. Boing! Ant-Man jumps around, the criminals try to capture him and just keep missing, and then Ant-Man uses another thing that he had briefly as a superpower back then, which was a little lasso made out of nylon fiber. As Ant-Man describes it, nylon is practically unbreakable. Yes, we all know that miracle substance nylon, the stuff that we cover our space shuttles and airplane black boxes in. I mean, who in the world could possibly get through a little bit of nylon? And while the criminals are busy looking for Ant-Man, who's hiding behind a statue, his ant allies carry a massive tarp of fly paper across the ceiling and drop it on top of them. Somehow none of these criminals saw a massive swarm of ants carrying a huge yellow tarp full of sticky fly paper across the ceiling, and it ties them all up. Ant-Man proudly proclaims his victory.
"Now we'll see how you jokers like the feel of fly paper."
The last of the criminals try to race to their car, but their tires have been slashed, and the police show up. A police officer, who's just sort of casually standing around with his gun drawn, talks to Ant-Man, saying, "We rounded up most of them. We'll pick the others up later." Ant-Man explains that Egghead had a shrewd plan. I don't know how shrewd that was, but I mean, sure, I guess if he's your enemy, you gotta build him up. But he made one mistake. He misunderstood the psychology of ants. He didn't know that the ants do not consider themselves my helpless slaves. They regard themselves as my friends and my partners in the war against crime. I bet at this point the cop is like, I don't know what the hell you're even talking about, man. You're talking about a lot of details that I have no idea what you're talking about. Ant-Man continues, Egghead tried to appeal to their sense of greed, of vanity, but insects have no such emotions. Unfortunately, it is only we humans who possess such primitive traits. According to Ant-Man, ants don't have vanity or greed, but they do believe in crime and injustice, and that's why they're going to be loyal to Ant-Man. They're his partners in fighting crime. Makes sense. And now we get a flashback showing that Ant-Man decided to take a bath in some oil so that the fly paper wouldn't stick to him. Although, keep in mind, in this shot, he is naked, and when he was supposedly captured, he was wearing his Ant-Man suit. But whatever, maybe we just didn't see him washing his clothes in this oil. Then we see Ant-Man popping some tires with a nail. That must have been fun. And finally, the ants themselves removed the keys from the criminal's car. The cops congratulate Ant-Man on his amazing victory, and we cut to Egghead in a sorry state of affairs. He now is unshaven, still has that bald dome, and is just living like a bum. In fact, some random guys that are watching him for unknown reasons call him exactly that, saying he's probably just some worthless bum without a brain in his head. Egghead is far from Ant-Man's most impressive villain. He is one of the very few recurring villains that's attached to Ant-Man specifically, as compared to Avengers enemies like Ultron, the evil robot that Hank Pym accidentally created. In the movies, you actually do get a brief shot of Egghead, but it is not really as an enemy of Hank Pym. Instead, he's the father of the character Ghost in the second Ant-Man movie, Ant-Man and the Wasp. He's doing some sort of science experiment that he messes up, and he kills himself and his wife and turns his daughter into an intangible monster. So, well done, Egghead. Egghead's biggest success as a criminal was causing the death of Hawkeye's brother, Barney, which is definitely a jerk move, but not quite as epic as, say, killing your actual enemy Ant-Man. He also came close to a successful revenge plot against Ant-Man once. He blackmailed Hank Pym, who was going then by the name Yellow Jacket, into trying to steal some precious metal, knowing that Hank was going to fail. Yellow Jacket was promptly arrested. Then, at Hank's trial, Egghead hired a bunch of supervillains to break Hank out, framing him as it looked like it was Hank's idea. But then Egghead got stupid and tried to make Hank build an anti-aging device. Now, why would Egghead need an anti-aging device? Well, we're specifically told that Egghead is sad because he's 52 and he knows that his life is therefore almost over. Yeah, we all know how at age 52, you're just a few short years from just shuffling off this mortal coil. You might as well give it all up. By age 52, everything is over. Instead of building an anti-aging device, which no one would know what that looks like or how it would work, Dr. Pym created a weapon and defeated all the supervillains. Egghead was ultimately killed, but not even by his arch-enemy Ant-Man. He was about to shoot a gun, and Hawkeye shows up, shoots an arrow down the barrel. Egghead still pulls the trigger and killed himself. So, yeah, Egghead was a pretty lame villain. Never really accomplished too much. Wasn't even worth using as the ultimate enemy in an Ant-Man movie. Thank you very much for taking some time to look at this bizarre little story from the Silver Age. The early Silver Age is still pretty wacky stuff. We were getting past the sort of schlocky 1950s sci-fi stories that DC and Marvel was doing, and starting with a little bit more grounded superhero stuff, but they were still just playing real fast and loose with how it all worked, and definitely not taking any time to do any real research, obviously. Just sort of inventing, ants must communicate electronically, so we can just create a device that speaks to them and translates that, and they'll know words like necklace and museum, because that's definitely something an ant would need to know in its daily life. I had fun doing this. Folks, next week I've got more superhero stuff for you, but this time about a very, very good superhero run. One, in fact, where I would argue that the creators are probably not being properly compensated for all they added to this character. So I'll leave that tantalizing hint. I'm going to see you in a week, and until then, please consider hitting like and subscribe. Also, just know that I do a weekly show on my second channel, Pros and Cons. That's on Mondays at 5 p.m. Pacific, where I'll review the comics that I read this week and then just draw something while I take questions from you in a live stream. So, love it if you could show up for that. Thank you so much for watching, and until I see you next time, keep reading comics. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please consider hitting like and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, there are merchandise links beneath the YouTube video, and you can always hit join on YouTube or visit Comic Tropes on Patreon to get access to special perks. Egghead tried to appeal to their sense of greed, of vanity, but insects have no such emotions. Unfortunately, it is only we humans. Okay. I'll redo this then.